Hello, welcome to today's Conversation channel. We are embarking on a deep dive into, well, perhaps the most defining and certainly the longest conflict of the 20th century, the Cold War. Our sources today are dense, providing a chronological, almost tactile account, taking us from the smoking ruins of 1945 all the way to the dramatic, quiet descent of the Soviet flag in 1991.
That's absolutely right. And our mission today isn't just to, recount events. It's to move swiftly and thoroughly through half a century of global tension, making sure we grasp the underlying mechanics. We're looking at what historians have called the longest and most silent war, a unique clash where, for the most part, armies stayed in their barracks, but the minds, the ideologies, the economies of two colossal powers collided violently, and in doing so shaped the fate of every corner of the planet.
And the sheer volume of material detailing this period, the pacts, the terrifying technological leaps, the proxy wars, and those near-miss moments where the entire world has held its breath, it can be profoundly overwhelming. But our goal is simple: to help you quickly grasp the essence of those invisible walls and the deep anxieties that really marked this era. We want you to feel the history, not just memorize the dates. So let's unpack this. We begin in 1945, standing quite literally in the ruins of the Second World War. Imagine stepping through a European capital, a city like Berlin or Warsaw, on a hazy, gunpowder-scented morning. Our sources describe the sound of crushed rubble underfoot, whispering that the fighting has stopped, yet there's this heavy, unsettling silence hanging in the air telling you that nothing is truly settled.
And what's fascinating here is the physical and psychological toll. Europe's ancient cities, the core of Western civilization, were just unrecognizable stone heaps. The documents call these ruins the broken bones of an old world. And the former military giants, the UK and France, they were standing there as tired old men, just shadows of their former selves. They'd won, yes, but the cost had been so immense that their imperial power had, for all intents and purposes, evaporated.
It speaks to the basic human condition, doesn't it? People weren't focused on geopolitics or imperial pride. Their singular focus was pure survival. Finding a piece of bread, securing a solid roof, or just locating family members became infinitely more valuable than any old colonial glory.
And into this immense dark vacuum, this pile of desperation and rubble, two new, gigantic, and completely opposing silhouettes rise to cover the sky. This contrast is the starting point, the absolute ground zero of the Cold War.
So on one side you have the West, specifically the United States. Their industrial machine had been working non-stop, their cities shining brightly, virtually untouched by destruction, and American industry, capital, and what the sources call that unshakable self-confidence. It all stood in this dazzling contrast to the gray ruin across the Atlantic. You see these confident American soldiers offering chocolate and cigarettes, a young giant ready and equipped to assert not just military but massive economic power globally.
And then you look east, toward the Soviet Union. The USSR was literally born from blood and fire. They bore the heaviest blows of the war, losing tens of millions of lives, countless cities razed to the ground. Yet they emerged from this horrific ordeal with a will hardened like steel. The Red Army's physical presence deep inside Europe, stretching all the way to Berlin, it signaled not just victory over Nazism, but a clear, dangerous intent to spread its ideology globally. Stalin, with his suspicious and calculating gaze, he wasn't thinking about reconstruction in the Western sense. He was already planning the invisible walls that would replace the ruined buildings. The mask of alliance was dropped the moment that common enemy was defeated.
So let's unpack this distrust by jumping back a few months to February 1945 to Yalta. We are at the Levadia Palace in Crimea. Outside, the weather is cold, the Black Sea is rough, but inside this high-ceilinged, velvet-draped hall, the political tension is suffocating, much sharper and hotter than any external cold.
Oh, absolutely. And what's truly fascinating here is the sheer audacity of it all. The setting and the stakes. Imagine Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin gathered around a massive map of Europe, viewing it with what one document calls sculptor's diligence. They weren't just discussing peace, they were redrawing the map of the world. The room was thick with blue tobacco smoke from Churchill's cigar and Stalin's pipe, a perfect visual for the murky and mysterious nature of diplomacy.
And this wasn't just any meeting. The table they sat at became the most ruthless bargaining counter in history. This is where the fate of millions of people, under which flag they would wake up, what economic system they would live under, was being determined. It must have felt surreal, determining the borders of entire nations with a pencil while thousands of soldiers were still dying on the actual front lines outside.
And Stalin's primary demand was absolute: securing the USSR's western borders forever. He was obsessed with building a wall of flesh and earth against any future German aggression, and this meant controlling the territories to his west. The fate of Poland became one of the bitterest, most tragic arguments. This country, whose independence the war was supposedly fought to secure, was literally shifted westward on the map, its eastern territories just annexed by the Soviets.
And a paper action like that leads to massive real-life migrations, dislocation, and eventual subjugation. Churchill tried desperately to contain the Soviet appetite, recognizing the danger, but the political reality was that the Red Army's boots were already firmly on the ground across Eastern Europe. His attempts at safeguarding democracy were just left hanging in the air, overpowered by Stalin's territorial facts.
Right. And the sources highlight this profound tragic irony. The peace that followed Yalta instantly brought about a deeper, colder conflict. The invisible fault line running from Berlin all the way south to the Adriatic and then geographically reaching Korea was forged at this smoky table. It was determined that borders would no longer be drawn by rivers or mountains, but by the impassable walls of ideologies. That single meeting condemned the world to a much longer, silent war.
And the end of the war brought something truly new, something that redefined conflict itself. Let's fast forward a few months to August 1945, and the terrifying silence over the Pacific. We hear the sound of a single plane, not the roar of hundreds, but a much more solitary, sinister sound preceding the blinding flash.
The documents detail this terrifying, instantaneous transition in the nature of warfare. At 8 a.m., the blinding flash over Hiroshima was like thousands of suns rising simultaneously, followed immediately by a silence far more frightening than the noise of any conventional battle. The slow, grinding death of trench warfare was replaced by cold and calculated absolute annihilation, achievable in a fraction of a second.
It was terrifying because death now came as an invisible wave from the sky, carving even the shadows of people onto walls, sweeping away military and civilian targets indiscriminately. That massive column of black and crimson smoke, the mushroom cloud, was the global tragedy of humanity suddenly gaining a power once thought only divine, the power to end itself instantly.
Exactly. And the message sent by the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not merely a military conclusion to the Pacific War. It was a profound, strategic, and existential shock delivered directly to Stalin in the Kremlin. The research stresses that the demonstration was explicitly directed at Moscow. The security of nations would now be determined not by the sheer size of armies and tanks, but by the overwhelming power of the bomb and the fear of mutual destruction.
This is where the world fundamentally changed. Before 1945, wars were won by courage, resources, strategy. Now, the destructive energy at the tip of a button rendered almost all of that meaningless in a major power confrontation. What do you think was the immediate strategic takeaway in Washington? That the bomb offered a decisive advantage?
Oh, absolutely. The initial feeling in Washington was one of temporary, unmatched security. They believed they held the ultimate bargaining chip, a decisive technical lead that could dictate terms. But what the sources also show is that this advantage was inherently fragile. Peace had become a terrifyingly fragile balance, a state the source calls standing on tenterhooks. The moment that monopoly was challenged, which everyone knew was inevitable, the stakes would become immeasurable.
And we know the resulting smoke eventually dispersed, but the enormous shadow it cast would never be erased. It was the beginning of the atom tree of nightmares, fueled by the relentless, quiet fear of annihilation that defined the next 4 decades. So let's move to 1946, and the formal public declaration of division. Winston Churchill, now the former prime minister, delivers his famous Sinews of Peace speech in Fulton, Missouri. That defining phrase, running from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, that wasn't just a geographical description, was it? It was the proclamation of an invisible barrier, a barrier more rigid than steel, descending across the European continent.
That's right. And the sources vividly capture the immediate political climate. While it might have been spring outside, the political atmosphere signaled a freezing cold that would define geopolitics for half a century. The Iron Curtain cut the map of Europe like a knife, separating political systems, economies, and families. When you look at the ancient capital cities that fell behind it, Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, their lights dimmed, replaced by the monotone gray of the Soviet system.
For the ordinary European trying to reconstruct their life, this meant a forced, brutal trade-off. Individual freedoms were swapped for state-guaranteed, rigid security. Individual dreams and ambition gave way to the rigid, centrally controlled plans of the state.
And that control was maintained through intense, pervasive surveillance. The Red Army, having arrived as liberators, systematically became permanent occupiers. Local administrations slowly fell under the iron fist of compliant communist parties. Imagine the daily pressure the moral corrosion caused by the constant fear of being an informer or being informed upon hanging over every conversation.
Life behind that curtain became a closed box, entirely isolated from the Western world. Communication was severely restricted. Travel was an impossible dream for most. The documents note that even simple things, like talking to relatives a few kilometers away across the new border, could take months of bureaucracy.
This created two entirely separate planets under the same sky. The West viewed the East as a dark and dangerous land of unpredictable power. For those trapped behind the curtain, the West became perceived as an impossible, corrupt, but tempting, forbidden paradise. And for Stalin, these satellite states served a clear purpose. They were buffer zones, securing his regime and keeping any potential Western attack far from the Soviet heartland.
The next year, 1947, marks perhaps the single biggest geopolitical shift of the century. We shift our gaze south to the Mediterranean Turkey and Greece. Britain, utterly exhausted, signals to Washington, "We can no longer carry the burden. It's your turn." This diplomatic cry silently dropped a massive responsibility onto the United States.
And this was far more than a simple changing of the guard. It was the U.S. being called upon to become the world's policeman, a role it had historically resisted through decades of isolationism. On March 12, 1947, President Truman addressed Congress, and the gravity of his expression signaled the declaration of a philosophy that would define America's role in the world for the next 50 years.
Truman stated that the U.S. must support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. This was an undeclared but unmistakably drawn line against the Soviet Union. The civil war in Greece, where communist guerrillas were active, and Soviet pressure on Turkey regarding the Straits. These are no longer seen as local matters. They instantly became central to American national security.
And this address birthed the fundamental policy of containment. Conceptually, think of it as constructing a massive and impassable dam wall against a rising flood. America believed that Soviet ideology would spread like a virus, exploiting every crack, every region weakened by poverty and instability. So the containment strategy aimed to pour concrete in the form of dollars and guns into every perceived leak across the globe.
But wait, were critics at the time arguing that this Truman Doctrine risked turning every local conflict into a global confrontation between the two superpowers? It seems like an open-ended invitation to interventionism.
That risk was keenly debated, yes. The administration was aware of it. However, the prevailing view among policy architects like George Kennan was that the Soviet leadership was inherently cautious. They would only push where there was no resistance. So the doctrine wasn't about rolling back communism. It was about presenting an unyielding barrier. This established a strange, essential relationship. A European farmer's tractor was now intrinsically linked to a tank waiting at the border. This blend of military and economic aid became a fundamental pillar of the modern world.
So the Truman Doctrine officially ended U.S. isolationism. The sudden arrival of American naval ships in the Mediterranean confirmed the borders of this new bipolar world. The rustling of the papers Truman signed were the first footsteps of future messy proxy wars. Vietnam, Korea, Latin America, confirming the world was irrevocably split into us and them.
And the Cold War wasn't just fought with bombs or tanks. It was fiercely fought with hunger and cold. The brutal winter of 1947, combined with the destruction left by the war, buried hope under frozen sidewalks. Factories stood idle, and mile-long bread lines formed. Desperation, poverty, and unemployment were the most fertile grounds imaginable for communist ideology to take root.
And into this desperation stepped U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall.
What I find so insightful is that his plan was absolutely not simple charity. It was a brilliant strategic move, a massive security wall woven from green dollars. The U.S. profoundly understood that economic collapse in Europe meant political collapse straight into the Soviet orbit. The scale was immense. $13 billion poured into 16 European countries. Imagine those giant cargo ships pulling up to ravaged ports, cranes unloading wheat sacks, massive tractors, and medical supplies. The sources note that every single crate, every sack of flour, bore an invisible American dream stamp. This assistance determined which system that person would pledge loyalty to, tying the continent irrevocably to the capitalist system.
The true insight of the Marshall Plan, then, was charity. It was the realization that prosperity was the most effective first line of defense against communism. It secured loyalty by appealing to basic needs.
Exactly. The genius of the Marshall Plan was its chosen weapon, comfort. An increase in a worker's wage or the ability to buy milk for a child was proven to be a more effective weapon against ideology than guns and cannons. However, looking east, this massive aid created deep anxiety for Moscow. Stalin viewed the offer as the Trojan horse of imperialism and strictly forbade his satellite states from accepting it.
And that refusal solidified the economic division. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov's walkout from the Paris Conference in 1947 signaled the permanent economic fracture of Europe long before the Berlin Wall was ever built. Nations like Czechoslovakia, initially eager for the funds, were severely reprimanded by Moscow and forced to close their doors.
Western Europe was metaphorically painted in the green color of the American dollar, stabilizing its democracy through economic vitality. Meanwhile, the East sank deeper into managed, centrally planned gray poverty, confirming that the war was now fought not just on geopolitical front lines, but at market stalls, bank vaults, and production lines.
The inevitable conflict over the German question quickly materialized. We moved to the first major physical confrontation of the Cold War, centered on that small, isolated democratic enclave in Soviet-occupied territory, West Berlin. In June 1948, Stalin, angered by the West introducing the new German mark, sealed all road, rail, and canal links. 2 million people were instantly trapped, facing starvation.
The psychological impact of being cornered was immense. Supplies would only last a few weeks. Stalin was testing the West's resolve, believing they would abandon the city rather than risk war. The only open path left to the Allies was the narrow air corridor above the clouds. General Lucius Clay ordered the operation that turned the sky into a relentless river of steel.
The logistics are staggering. Try to imagine the continuous, monotonous engine sounds of the C-54s landing at Tempelhof Airport every 90 seconds, 24 hours a day. The documents call this continuous rhythmic sound the city's heartbeat, the sole rhythm of survival. They brought flour, dried milk, and tons of coal, which was more precious than gold at the time.
And the irony was not lost on the Berliners. The same aircraft that just a few years earlier rained death and fire were now bringing life and hope. This moral reversal was so powerful. Children waited eagerly for the sugar bombers, pilots who dropped tiny parachutes with chocolate and gum. This operation was a logistical masterpiece, but it was also a powerful psychological victory against Stalin's brutality.
After nearly a year, Stalin was forced to lift the blockade in May 1949, admitting defeat without a shot being fired. The cost of underestimating the West's resolve was immense. Critically, the blockade's failure confirmed the irreversible division of Germany and established West Berlin firmly in Washington's orbit. It was the unextinguished lantern in the Communist Sea.
The air bridge victory provided relief, but the fear remained heavy in Western Europe. Leaders in Paris and London felt the immediate, chilling threat of the massive Red Army, knowing their own armies were weak.
Security for any citizen in that period meant constantly waiting for the enormous red threat to arrive. Their once powerful armies were exhausted. This deep-seated fear drove Europe to seek refuge with the power across the ocean.
On April 4, 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed in Washington. The source describes the sound of the pen scratching the paper as the sound of a steel vest being meticulously woven, changing the global power balance forever.
The core of the alliance, Article 5, was truly revolutionary. An attack on one is considered an attack on us all. This clause committed America to European security, a definitive abandonment of centuries of strategic isolationism. 12 nations united, bound by a common existential fear of the East.
And with the establishment of NATO, the alliance moves quickly from paper to operational reality. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander, rapidly turning the treaty into a real army with standardized weaponry and command chains. The West effectively became a monolithic political and military bloc, an impassable wall for the Soviet bloc. For the ordinary person in Europe, NATO was a concrete guarantee.
But before August 1949, the U.S. was living in a state of grace, a fragile, peaceful dream. The military experts were confident, whispering that the Soviets needed at least 10 more years to develop the bomb. There was this comfortable but deceptive illusion that the atomic cloud was reserved only for America's enemies.
That dream was shattered forever on August 29, 1949. On the desolate steppes of Kazakhstan, the device they called First Lightning exploded. It didn't just destroy a few mock buildings, it smashed the glass castle of American invincibility into a million pieces.
The sources confirm that radioactive traces picked up by American reconnaissance planes confirmed the shocking reality immediately. The crucial time window that the U.S. had relied upon for its strategic dominance suddenly, violently evaporated. The message was existential. The enemy possessed an equally lethal sword. Distance was now meaningless.
And the psychological impact in the West was severe. This was the moment of profound existential dread. Public panic in the U.S. led to duck-and-cover drills in schools and a scramble to build backyard bunkers. People internalized the fact that their safety was no longer guaranteed by the oceans.
Security was now guaranteed not by armies, but by the terror of mutual destruction. A tense, silent standoff now locked in place. The monopoly was broken. This was the moment the atom tree of nightmares truly took root, where the cold breath of invisible competition would be felt in every skyward glance for decades.
And our journey now turns dramatically to the Far East, to the Korean Peninsula. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces, backed by Soviet T-34 tanks, crossed the 38th parallel. The comfortable term Cold War instantly lost its meaning in Asia, replaced by the reality of hot blood and gunpowder.
The swift fall of Seoul sent a shockwave through Western capitals. President Truman viewed this aggression not as a civil war, but as a direct global test of communist expansion, just like fascist aggression in the 1930s. The question in the White House was, if we don't stop it now, where next? The U.S. intervened swiftly under the new UN flag.
American soldiers, still fresh from WWII, suddenly found themselves mired in unfamiliar, brutal terrain. The war quickly escalated when UN forces pushed north to the Yalu River, dangerously close to the Chinese border, believing the conflict would end by Christmas.
That hope was brutally dashed. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers poured across the front lines in the dark and snow, spurred by terrifying bugle and whistle calls. Modern technology was overwhelmed by sheer numbers and fanatical belief. The front lines quickly recoiled, freezing eventually around the 38th parallel.
The conflict settled into a grueling, positional World War I-style trench warfare. A gray, murderous cycle of fighting not just the enemy, but the cold, the heat, the mud. Soldiers fought futile assaults on nameless, heavily fortified hills, often dubbed Bloody Ridge or Pork Chop Hill. It became clear that the objective was no longer outright victory, but survival and stalemate.
And meanwhile, far away from the mud, the bureaucracy of tragedy unfolded at Panmunjom. Diplomats engaged in endless, frustrating truce talks, arguing over the most absurd minutiae, the precise shape of the negotiating table, the size of the flags, or the commas in a protocol. It was the epitome of bureaucratic absurdity, where human lives were traded against diplomatic formalities.
The armistice finally arrived in July 1953, but it's crucial to remember this was an armistice, not a peace treaty. The borders remained virtually unchanged after 3 years of horrendous destruction and millions of casualties. The Korean War remains a half-finished story, a brutal, bloody chapter that concluded only in an uneasy, tense silence, the silence of unfinished business. In March 1953, the rigid dynamic of the Cold War was violently interrupted. We have to reflect on the sheer terror surrounding Joseph Stalin's demise. Imagine the remote dacha in Kuntsevo. Stalin lay motionless on the floor after a stroke, yet the sources confirm his personal guards dared not enter for hours, paralyzed by the fear of being executed for disturbing him. This was the profound, dark irony of the fear empire he built. His own system ensured his lonely demise.
The moment the news broke, there was an immediate, immense wave of collective, programmed grief mixed with private, panicked uncertainty. What happens to us now? Stalin had cultivated the image of a semi-divine figure responsible for everything from national destiny to the daily bread supply.
But the real storm was raging behind the thick walls of the Kremlin. At the funeral, the four men who stood shoulder to shoulder, Beria, Malenkov, Molotov, and Khrushchev, were already intensely weighing each other up, sharpening their knives. The documents confirmed this was one of the most ruthless power struggles in recent history, fought with security files and poisoned rumors.
Lavrenti Beria, the terrifying chief of the secret police, seemed closest to seizing power. But the others, recognizing the threat he posed to all of them, quickly allied against him. The execution of Beria that summer, crushed by the very system he helped create, showed graphically that power transitions in the regime were achieved by blood and conspiracy.
And Nikita Khrushchev, famously underestimated for his peasant cunning and volatile temperament, slowly rose by strategically eliminating his rivals. While Stalin's terrifying shadow gradually lifted, the era remained gray and filled with intense intrigue. The immense machine he built continued to turn, just with a new operator.
The Cold War quickly found its institutional symmetry. The rationale for the Warsaw Pact in 1955 was a deep trauma for the Eastern Bloc. West Germany joining NATO and its subsequent rearmament. The memory of the 20 million Soviet dead in WWII was too fresh for Moscow to tolerate this.
Signed in Warsaw, the treaty was a legal cloak for occupation. It formalized the military presence that was already there, legally binding the armies of 8 Eastern Bloc nations under Moscow's direct command.
So the appointment of Marshal Ivan Konev as commander meant Soviet tanks went from occupier to Allied protector. But, as one source notes, the direction of the barrels had not changed. This sealed the entire Eastern Bloc in a steel belt. The door to the outside world, already shut, was now triple locked.
The declaration institutionalized the Deuces versus them military division of Europe. Peace was now entirely delegated to the cold and distant discipline of mutual fear, protected by millions of troops and thousands of nuclear warheads.
With Stalin gone, a brief, treacherous thaw allowed hope to bloom. In 1956, the Hungarian people asked, "Can we achieve a measure of genuine national freedom too?" This was the short-lived hope of spring.
The iconic symbol of resistance emerged on October 23rd. Students and citizens tore the imposed Soviet coat of arms out of the center of the Hungarian flags, leaving a flag with a gaping hole. A powerful symbol the sources called a perforated heart, representing a nation seeking its own identity.
Imre Nagy's reformist government declared a stunning and highly risky withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact, an act of geopolitical madness in that era. People waited desperately for aid from the West, glued to their radios, unaware their desperate calls were tragically drowned out by the noise of the Suez Crisis unfolding simultaneously.
The crushing reality arrived violently on November 4th with Operation Whirlwind. Thousands of T-54 tanks rumbled into Budapest before dawn. It was an immediate, tragic struggle. Brave young people fighting steel giants with only improvised Molotov cocktails and sheer will.
Radio Budapest's last desperate, choked cry, "Help us," confirmed the brutal truth of the Cold War. The geopolitical lines were definite, drawn in nuclear threat, and no one would cross that line and risk World War III for Hungary. The Iron Curtain was proved to be a real wall, protected by blood and steel. Hope was crushed, giving way to a decades-long silence.
The simultaneous Suez Crisis of 1956 was pivotal, marking the clear end of the old world order. The Suez Canal was the strategic windpipe of the old colonial empires. When Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the canal, London and Paris reacted with shock and fury, still operating under a 19th century mindset.
The joint invasion by the UK, France, and Israel was a swift military success but a monumental political catastrophe. The crisis immediately exposed who the real global masters were, the two superpowers. President Eisenhower was absolutely furious that his allies acted without informing him, viewing it as a destabilizing move.
Meanwhile, Khrushchev seized the opportunity, threatening to rain rockets on London and Paris, positioning the Soviet Union as the defender of the post-colonial world. This combination of Soviet nuclear threats and devastating U.S. economic pressure, specifically the forced devaluation of the British pound, forced a humiliating retreat.
Britain, once the empire on which the sun never set, was revealed as a tired old giant, utterly unable to act on the global stage without U.S. approval. The void left behind in the Middle East was instantly filled by escalating U.S. and Soviet influence, turning the entire region into a complex Cold War chessboard. The era of superpowers had begun. Back in the U.S., 1957 was viewed as the golden age. Americans trusted their technology implicitly. Space was merely science fiction, but on October 4, 1957, that changed violently.
The Soviet R-7 rocket launched Sputnik 1, a small, polished aluminum sphere. As it circled the globe, its simple, rhythmic beep, beep, beep was far more than a technical achievement. It was a jarring alarm bell, a technological Pearl Harbor.
Imagine an American father listening to that signal on his radio, realizing with a sinking feeling, they are passing over our heads and we can do absolutely nothing. The true threat wasn't the satellite itself, but the massive intercontinental ballistic missile technology that carried it.
This was the ultimate fear trigger. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could deliver a nuclear warhead to Washington or New York in under 30 minutes. The protective shield of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans instantaneously evaporated. The sky was no longer neutral, but a direct attack corridor.
This national shock led to the frantic creation of NASA and massive investment in science and education. Initial efforts resulted in spectacular failures, like the Vanguard rocket, nicknamed Kaputnik by the press. The stars lost their innocence, and the space age began as the most dangerous front of the Cold War.
The urgency continued. For the 40th anniversary of the revolution, the Kremlin demanded another spectacle. In November 1957, Laika, a calm stray dog, was rushed into space. Her death, known to be inevitable, proved that the race was being fought on biological frontiers, illustrating the ruthless cruelty of ideological progress.
Then came the triumph that cemented Soviet psychological dominance. In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin launched into orbit with the now iconic cry, "Pa-Kali, let's go." His 108-minute journey was hailed globally.
Looking out a small window, he famously observed, "The Earth is blue." The sheer perspective from orbit made the artificial borders of the fractured world seem meaningless. Gagarin, the working-class hero, became the USSR's most potent propaganda weapon, once again leaving the US feeling the burden of being left behind.
By 1961, East Germany was politically hemorrhaging. The regime desperately needed a physical stopper because it was rapidly losing its most valuable citizens, workers, doctors, engineers to the West via Berlin, the regime's bleeding wound.
Overnight, between August 12-13, 1961, Operation Rose began. 25,000 soldiers and police started tearing the city's heart out. Imagine a Berliner waking up to the ominous sound of pneumatic drills and falling barbed wire where their sidewalk had been hours before. It was a deep psychological shock.
The wall immediately became a concrete dagger, brutally separating families, lovers, and colleagues. We see these desperate, traumatic scenes, people leaping from apartment windows onto blankets held by Western firefighters. The sources note that the distance between freedom and death was now just one paving stone wide.
Over time, the temporary wire became imposing concrete blocks, deadly guard towers, and the infamous death strip. The Berlin Wall became the most concrete, most cruel symbol where the conscience of humanity was buried. The direct confrontation between American and Soviet tanks coming nose-to-nose at Checkpoint Charlie in October forced the world to hold its breath.
The wall's completion turned Berlin into the grim symbol of the Cold War. One side was colorful, consumerist, and loud. The other, gray, deprived, and silent. And the silence imposed by the regime was far heavier than the concrete itself.
We arrive at the absolute peak of tension, the moment humanity came closest to self-annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. An American U-2 spy plane secretly photographed Soviet nuclear missiles hidden in the tropical foliage of Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida.
The discovery plunged the Oval Office into an atmosphere of suffocating dread. Advisors loosened their ties, and the only sound was the invisible clock counting down to the apocalypse. President Kennedy's public address informed the world their very existence hung by a thread. Public panic was immediate, churches filled, canned goods were looted, and families said goodbye.
The brink was reached on Black Saturday. U.S. naval ships and Soviet freighters came nose to nose. But the most terrifying moment occurred inside a Soviet submarine, shaken by U.S. depth charges. The crew nearly launched a nuclear torpedo. The world's fate hung in that narrow metal room until an officer named Vasily Arkhipov vetoed the decision without clear authorization from Moscow.
The resolution, reached through frantic secret negotiations between Khrushchev and Kennedy, involved a mutual compromise: the visible removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for the quiet removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey.
The aftermath was profoundly sobering. Humanity had stared into the abyss of its own destruction and returned, older, wiser, and deeply marked by the fear. The greatest strategic outcome was the subsequent establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline, a direct communication link, acknowledging that the price of peace was communication, not victory.
Following the crisis, the focus of the Cold War rapidly shifts to Southeast Asia. For Washington, Vietnam was a falling game piece in the context of the all-important domino theory. Eisenhower's theory held that if Vietnam fell to communism, all neighboring nations would quickly follow.
The subsequent U.S. intervention led to a military nightmare. U.S. generals, accustomed to clear fronts and uniformed enemies, faced an existential challenge. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. A peasant in a rice field by day became an invisible guerrilla phantom by night. American soldiers experienced deep paranoia and fatigue.
The iconic, relentless sound of the helicopter thwack became the war's defining soundtrack. Despite massive technological superiority, the Viet Cong guerrillas hid in vast, elaborate underground tunnel networks, emerging only when the bombs stopped. Vietnam became a devastating swamp metaphor. The more power you exerted, the deeper you sank. Technology proved helpless against human will and geography.
The psychological turning point came during the Tet Offensive in 1968. The Viet Cong launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, even briefly penetrating the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. While a military failure for the VC, the graphic images broadcast back home shattered the American public's perception that the war was winnable.
And this was the crucial distinction. It was the living room war. Television brought the conflict, raw and uncensored burning villages, napalm directly into American homes. The public belief in a just war slowly eroded. The conflict consumed America's soul, its innocence, and its belief in its own moral and military invincibility. forcing a profound strategic reevaluation.
Meanwhile, back in Europe, a dangerous new challenge to Soviet authority arose. In the spring of 1968, Czechoslovakia's new leader, Alexander Dubček, initiated reforms aimed at creating human-faced socialism. This meant lifting censorship, rehabilitating victims of Stalinist purges, and encouraging democracy.
This created a dizzying atmosphere of intellectual excitement. Cafes and universities were filled with open political debate, a flow of ideas like an open dam. Dubček's reforms were an attempt to reconcile socialism with genuine freedom, something Moscow viewed as an existential threat.
Moscow's reaction was swift and furious. For Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, this was not reform. It was a contagious and dangerous virus that threatened to spread, undermining the security of the entire Eastern Bloc.
The inevitable invasion began on the night of August 21, 1968. 2,000 tanks and 200,000 soldiers from the Warsaw Pact entered Prague. The people reacted with stunned, anguished betrayal, screaming at the soldiers, "Why are you here? There is no counter-revolution."
The sources detail the people's brave yet futile passive resistance, removing street signs, standing in front of tanks. But the cold mathematics of power prevailed. Brezhnev's doctrine was clear. Moscow asserted the right to intervene militarily in any socialist state where it felt that the system was under threat. The Prague Spring gave way to a long, gray, silent winter.
By the early 1970s, both superpowers were exhausted, the US by Vietnam, the USSR by chronic economic strain. They began seeking a pragmatic way to coexist. This was the era of détente, the relaxing grip. The red phone now rang not just in crisis, but for regular diplomatic greetings.
This shift wasn't driven by mutual affection, but by mutual necessity. Richard Nixon's historic 1972 visit to Moscow symbolized this shift. The bitter enemies joked, drank, and most importantly, signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, Salty One Treaty, momentarily freezing the collective fear.
Détente was an effort to manage the competition, not end it. The ultimate symbol arrived in 1975 when the Apollo and Soyuz spacecraft successfully docked in orbit. American astronaut Thomas Stafford and Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov shook hands in space, proving humanity could unite above, even if divided below.
However, détente was a mandatory truce, not genuine friendship. It was politically beneficial for the Soviets, driven by their desperate need for Western grain and technology. For the U.S., it was driven by the Vietnam syndrome. Critically, while headlines emphasized peace, work continued relentlessly in military research labs. Peace was merely borrowed time.
The fragile truce of détente ended violently. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 was the death knell of the era. Brezhnev's ill-fated decision launched the Red Army into its own Vietnam, a bloody trap that would break the empire's back.
The Soviet military expected a quick victory, but their modern war machines proved clumsy in the steep valleys of Afghanistan. They faced not a regular army, but tenacious local fighters called mujahideen, whose faith was harder than steel. Tanks that ruled by day became metal coffins by night.
For years, the war's most fearsome symbol was the Soviet Mi-24 Hind helicopter, the Devil's Chariot. But the tide turned dramatically in 1986 with the introduction of US-supplied shoulder-fired Stinger missiles.
This was the critical technological tipping point. The hunter became the hunted. Those supposedly invincible helicopters suddenly became fireballs easily shot down. The skies were no longer safe. Meanwhile, the human cost back home was paid for by the Zinc Boys, zinc-covered coffins returning silently to Soviet cities, eroding faith in the regime.
The war became an immense drain on the fragile Soviet economy and morale. When General Boris Gromov, the last Soviet soldier, walked across the Friendship Bridge in 1989, he carried the weight of a defeated war and a failing empire.
The Soviet system began to crumble, not from external assault, but from internal contradiction. In August 1980, thousands of workers at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, Poland, ceased work. An immense irony in a worker's paradise. This was dynamite under the system's foundation.
Lech Walesa, an ordinary electrician, jumped over the iron gates, becoming the voice of the crowd. Crucially, his demands weren't just about money, but political taboos. Freedom of the press, the right to strike, and an independent trade union.
The movement, Solidarity, spread like wildfire across Poland. The signing of the Gdansk Agreement was a symbolic victory. Walesa signed the document with a large, comical souvenir pen. This was the first and largest crack in the Iron Curtain.
But the dark winter came in December 1981. General Jaruzelski declared martial law, fearing a Soviet invasion. Tanks rolled out, phone lines were cut, and solidarity was outlawed. However, the lock in people's minds was already broken. The silent resistance that followed Millions lighting candles in their windows prove that communism was sustained only by the brute strength of the bayonet.
The Soviet Union's final leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, recognized that the system was rusting from within. He introduced two massive reform efforts: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. His intention was to save the communist project, not destroy it.
Glasnost was a dizzying freedom for a society conditioned to whispering. People suddenly had the right to speak, to read banned books, 1984, The Gulag Archipelago, and they began discussing past atrocities loudly, shattering the wall of fear.
The brutal test of glasnost came with the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. The state's initial silence, followed by forced admission, proved that secrecy was not sustainable. Public trust dissolved along with the radiation. The chilling realization for the Soviet populace was, they cannot protect us. They are actively lying to us.
Here is the central paradox that doomed Gorbachev. While minds were fed truth through glasnost, perestroika brought only economic chaos. His limited attempts at decentralizing planning failed disastrously. Shelves were emptier than ever. Sugar, soap, and even vodka were rationed.
The system achieved neither the efficiency of a market economy nor the stability of the old planned economy. The bitter joke circulated widely. Freedom doesn't fill the stomach.
Gorbachev aimed only to fix the foundation, but his first tap of the hammer revealed the entire structure was rotten. Glasnost gave people the right to speak, and they immediately used that right to demand separation. Nationalism sparked violently. The genie of freedom was out of the bottle.
The pressure cooker that was East Germany had to explode. The regime was desperate, trying to stop the continuous emigration via neighboring countries.
The collapse came via bureaucratic farce. On November 9, 1989, East German spokesman Günter Schabowski, tired and confused, mistakenly announced that travel restrictions were lifted immediately.
The news created an electric wave of disbelief, followed by a tentative, then rapidly determined movement of people walking toward the forbidden border crossing. The sources call this the purest moment where courage defeated fear.
Facing an ever-growing, unarmed human sea, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Jaeger, lacking orders, took the initiative and lifted the barrier. East Berliners flooded west, greeted by West Berliners with champagne and flowers, a chaotic, emotional explosion of joy.
People climbed onto the hated, ugly concrete, dancing on the wall's surface, understanding the Cold War was ending right there, under their feet. The sound of hammers hitting the concrete proved the Iron Curtain was woven from human fear, and once that fear ended, the curtain tore like gauze.
The noisy two-stroke Trabant cars advance honking through the luxury streets of the West, their blue exhaust fumes smelling distinctly like freedom. The world changed the next morning. The wound was closed.
Despite the euphoria of 1989, the Soviet Empire resisted its final demise for 2 more years. The last gasp came with the failed coup by hardline generals in August 1991. The coup failed instantly when Boris Yeltsin, standing atop a tank, symbolically challenged the old system, earning the loyalty of the people.
The fissure quickly became a full break. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia declared and secured their independence. The authority of the Central Soviet government evaporated.
The ultimate death blow came quietly in December 1991. In a chilly hunting lodge in Belarus, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the document dissolving the USSR. The largest state in the world was erased with a few strokes of a pen, proving its structure was fragile and artificial.
The culmination came on Christmas evening, December 25, 1991. That dramatic scene, broadcast live globally, was the true finale. The hammer and sickle flag, which had flown over the Kremlin for 74 years, was slowly lowered for the final time. The deep, heavy silence created a more profound impact than any cannon fire could have.
The Cold War officially ended on December 26, 1991. The massive burden of fear and nuclear threat was suddenly lifted. Capitalism and democracy prevailed. But the legacy, the 15 newly independent states, the economic hardships, the simmering ethnic conflicts, remained a complex and enduring shadow. We have raced through 46 years of immense tension, technological rivalry, and existential near misses. If we synthesize this massive flow of information, the underlying thread is clear. The conflict was fundamentally a contest over loyalty. Which system could offer the better material life and ideological narrative? It was the dollar versus the doctrine.
And it's the evocative details that bring that incredible timeline to life, helping you internalize the massive scale of events. The secretive, smoke-filled room at Yalta, the steady heartbeat of the sugar bombers over Berlin, the tragic sound of Laika's heart racing in that capsule, the blue exhaust fumes of the little Trabant cars smelling distinctly like freedom.
So, what does this all mean for us today? The central lesson, learned most painfully at the brink of the Cuban Missile Crisis, was that global security was guaranteed not by trust, but by the cold and distant discipline of mutual fear. The ultimate guarantee of peace was the certainty of mutually assured destruction.
But the deeper victory occurred later. The Cold War truly ended not when one side won a military battle, but when the fear imposed by the state, by tanks in Budapest and guards at the Berlin Wall, became fundamentally less potent than the hunger for freedom. The people simply stopped being afraid of the state.
And that raises an important question for you to consider. Now that the great external ideological enemy is gone, what new internal invisible wall, perhaps built from cynicism, polarization, or willful ignorance, should modern societies be most vigilant against? Something to mull over as you drift off to sleep.
Good night.